But suppose there are good ways and bad ways of coping with losing your job, right? Do you think some people might cope with things like that worse than others do? And most people will say, well, yeah, like obviously, that's a truism, like self-evidently. So in that case, what would it look like for somebody to cope with it well or cope with it wisely? So then they'll kind of like describe what that would look like. So if somebody coped with it wisely, what would happen next? And then what would happen? And then what would happen? And then looking back on it from that perspective, in retrospect, how catastrophic would it seem to them? Well, however they phrase it, not as catastrophic as it originally did, right? So
This is modeling, right? What you referred to as earlier.
You're finding ways of using questioning just to kind of tease out some more flexibility to help people to find an alternative way of looking at things. A more direct way of using modeling would be, who do you admire for their resilience? How would people that you admire for their resilience evaluate losing their job? So somebody that you admire for wisdom, temperance, patience, if they lost their job, would they say, this can't happen, it's awful, I can't handle it? Or would they frame it differently than that? And people usually almost like slightly begrudgingly, well, I guess they would like phrase it differently. And if you were to emulate the way that they are framing it, what would be the consequences of that? Well, I'd probably deal with it much better and it wouldn't be as distressing and stuff like that, right? So people are kind of quite attached to their rigid beliefs and their catastrophic thinking. So usually, there's kind of an art to asking the right type of questions that nudge them into a slightly less extreme, slightly less rigid way of looking at things usually.
To me, it feels like a return to sanity.
Yeah.
Whatever that approximates to.
I agree. In many cases, like what emerges at the end of cognitive therapy is, sometimes I say to people, if we got together all of the clients who have genuinely benefited from cognitive behavioral therapy, and we interviewed them and asked them what the big insights were that they achieved that helped them to overcome their problems, and we wrote them all down in a book, I say it would be the most boring book in the world, right? Because I can tell you right now, it would say a lot of stuff like, I just realized it wasn't worth getting angry about stuff anymore. Or I realized that I was kind of exaggerating how catastrophic things were. And you'd read it and think, really? Is that it? So you said it's a return to common sense, right? It sounds kind of banal in a way. It can take a lot of effort to get somebody to realize something which, in a sense, is kind of banal, just viewing things realistically, basically. But that's what the Stoics say. The goal is to get back to a rational, realistic appraisal of things, to get things in... Getting things in perspective isn't sexy. Getting things in perspective when you explain it, that's partly why people need therapy. It's partly why you can't just tell them the answers. Because the answers in some ways sound too obvious. We don't see the wood for the trees a lot of the time.
In Zen, they have the saying that water heats gradually and boils suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that moment of comprehension, when it lands and you get it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process to get there. And we all have our own individual processes of what we're moving through. And it's kind of fun to be on a journey, of self-discovery, and that there's more to learn, more to grow. And that perpetual student mindset is an exciting adventure. If you know what everything is, then where does the possibility for learning more arise?
It would be like a kind of death in a way.
Yeah.
To be human is to be fallible and ignorant, and imperfect. To be human is to have anxiety and to have cravings and to have problems. I think people too readily have this desire to kind of eliminate all their weaknesses and eliminate all of the problems. And I don't think there's anything wrong with dealing with those things and moderating them. But the truth is that if we completely got rid of all of our problems and all of our weaknesses, we'd all die of boredom. It's part of human nature to get anxious about things sometimes and, to have habits and cravings to deal with. There's nothing, inherently terrible about that. As long as we kind of manage to keep things within perspective, it's part of what it means to grow and live, as you're saying. It's the journey of life, is identifying our weaknesses, accepting them and learning from them and dealing with them. It's what makes us who we are. And I imagine, if there were such a thing as the gods, like they probably look at human beings and envy us in a sense, because they think there's something noble about being human and being fallible, being perfect. Potentially, I imagine the gods would all be quite bored. And they think occasionally we have to come to Earth and incarnate ourselves as humans so that we can kind of go through this adventure, of being ignorant and temporary madness, infallibility, and dealing with that. It's part of the drama of human life.
It's the drama we're here to play.
Yeah.
I read in your recent Substack article of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, you talked about the double meanings of that title and this idea of kingship. Who rules themselves in our world? Who would you point to? Seneca's line, the greatest empire is to be emperor of oneself. And what are your thoughts on that? Kingship being a state of mind, not a station.
That's how the Stoics and Socratic philosophers in general, I think, had this idea. The famous, it's like a kind of famous trope or like theme in ancient philosophy. The best example would be our buddy Alexander the Great, right? So he's the most powerful man in the world and like this hugely accomplished military figure. But the legend is that he encountered Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes the Cynic was like the dregs of society in a sense. He was a criminal who had been exiled from his home city, and he lived like a beggar, basically. So in Athenian terms, he was like the lowest of the low in a way. And yet he was admired for his strength of character and his wisdom. And the story goes, the famous anecdote is that Alexander the Great wanted to see him, and he went to visit him. And he said, is there anything that I can do for you? And Alexander said, yes, can you step aside? You're blocking the sun. Which is deeply metaphorical, because Alexander claimed to be the incarnation of the sun god. So he was the kind of fake sun, and Diogenes wanted to, see the real sun that he was obscuring. And there's another story that as he was walking away, Alexander's retinue thought this was kind of ridiculous and Diogenes was an idiot. But Alexander said, if I wasn't Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes.